Hi everybody, this is Miriam. How you guys doing tonight? Welcome to a part 2 of True Bigfoot Encounters, an encounter of Sasquatch saving humans, part 2. Hope you guys will enjoy it. Before we get into that, apparently there was some bunch of activity going on in Ohio. Apparently a couple weeks ago, what I heard, there was a meteor that had crashed, which caused tremors in a certain part of Ohio, and apparently it caused a large commotion of Bigfoot sightings surging all over a certain county in Ohio. I found an article about it. I'll read it to you. It says, not since the 1970s, Minerva monsters have Ohio residents been seen enamored with potential Bigfoot sightings. Recently, a flurry of social media posts about alleged sightings of a massive beast have left residents in Portage County, Ohio, on the lookout for infamous Sasquatch. 10 individual people were like, yeah, I was like walking my dog when I saw a big creature with a musty odor and suddenly it ran. Portage County Sheriff Bruce Zukowski told local CW affiliate in early March. People reached out to the Portage County Sheriff's Office and Garrettsville Police Department for the latest updates on official reported sightings, but did not receive an immediate response. Reactions to the reported Bigfoot sightings range from sincere to skeptical. Jeremiah Byron, host of the Bigfoot Society podcast, believes the claims and told local Fox affiliate that it's not normal to have so many sightings so close together. No crap. Byron cited several reports, including 2 friends hiking who said they spotted a 10-foot Sasquatch and a man who took his dog out at 4 a.m. local time, only for the dog to seemingly be startled by a large shadowy figure at the woodline. The Bigfoot community is extremely excited because we thought we'd never live through anything like this again, where there's a massive amount of sightings in such a short amount of time, Byron told the local radio there down in Ohio. Others, like local chiropractor Dr. John Baranski, have enjoyed engaging with the posts but don't seriously believe Bigfoot exists. There is a joke that we put on Facebook that he did arrive at the office while I was at lunchtime and was seeing a couple patients while I wasn't there. Regardless of whether you believe in Bigfoot or not, the figure remains relevant in pop culture. Mostly recently, the documentary filmmaker Mark Evans produced film debuting that said finally proves that most famous Bigfoot film of all time is nothing more than an incredible hoax. I've never watched that documentary. It doesn't sound like I want to. So that's the sightings that's happened. That's pretty exciting. And they said if you guys have had any more Bigfoot sightings in Ohio, just if you're in Ohio area, just to report them at bigfootsociety@gmail.com. That's for the Bigfoot Society podcast. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the reading of part 2 of Bigfoot Encounters. It's called Modoc Man. Right before the turn of the 20th century, a band of Modoc Native Americans, dissatisfied with the reservation they were forced to live on, traveled back to California from the Oregon reservation led by Captain Jack, Chief Kintsbuesh. Their arrival, the Modoc, and their refusal to go back to the reservation started the U.S. Modoc War. By the end of the war, which is best characterized as more of a winter siege, the Modoc were forced back to the reservation. Yeah, I agree, Kat. It's not a hoax. Several years later, one of the Modoc men who refused to be forced to live on a reservation, returned to Northern California to live in the country he loved. Inoki was born in Northern California near Mount Shasta in 1853. By the time Inoki was 20 years old, he had already fathered children and fought in the U.S. Modoc War. After raising his children, the old Indian, now a grandfather, decided to move back to Northern California and leave the reservation. Between some amazing luck and the help of a white friend, Inoki was able to purchase a mountain property near Tule Lake, where he built a log cabin and lived until his death in 1935. He passed away on the side of a river bend, where he laid down to take a nap and peacefully drifted away, never to wake up again. It was a very peaceful passing for a very interesting person. Inoki's interesting life was extremely eventful, but perhaps the two most interesting events were his encounters with Mata Kagami, Modoc for Bigfoot or Sasquatch. If Inoki's accounts are indeed true, they are by far two of the most amazing encounters that have ever been recorded. The economic drive of the Western man and his insatiable greed brought white settlers by the tens of thousands to the west coast of the country. What was once a very wild and beautiful landscape soon started to take form as the white settlers molded permanent settlements up and down the west coast. The years that followed white settlement would prove just as devastating for the Modoc people as it had with other native tribes. Before long, the Native American way of life would become endangered. Living off the land in traditional Native American fashion became increasingly more difficult. With that said, Inoki clung hard to the old traditions and for the most part lived completely off the land. One of Inoki's greatest source of food was fish. He regularly traveled to the various fishing holes in the area to catch lunch, dinner, and breakfast. Inoki had just finished a particularly successful fishing trip when he was heading back to his log cabin. The sun had just set, and it was quickly growing dark. Inoki was walking along a rather long deer trail when he saw what he believed was a very out-of-place bush in the distance area ahead. It was an unusual tall bush, and Inoki decided to investigate. As he walked closer to the bush, he was met with a strong musky odor. Once he was able to see the bush clearly, he gave it a real good up and down investigation. There was something very strange about this bush. After a few moments, Inoki realized that this bush was covered in hair. This isn't a bush at all. This isn't a bush at all, Inoki thought to himself. He took a step closer, and the creature, which Inoki had mistaken as a bush, made a noise. Nya! In that moment, Inoki realized what he had stumbled across. It was the man of the mountain the old ones had always spoke about. It was a Sasquatch. Despite the growing darkness, Inoki's close proximity allowed him to clearly see the creature. He watched as two soft brown eyes appeared from behind the thick horse-like hairs that covered the Sasquatch's head. The creature made a slight movement, and Inoki responded with a friendly gesture. He noticed that the creature had looked at his fish several times in their short encounter, so he laid the string of fish he had spent all day catching down on the ground in front of the Sasquatch. The Sasquatch immediately recognized the gesture for what it was and snatched the fish up and off the ground. It gave one last glance at Inoki with its soft brown eyes before making a quick sprint into the nearby timber. Inoki watched as the creature grew smaller and smaller in the distance. It then stopped and looked back toward Inoki and let out an extremely loud sound, a sound Inoki never forgot. In a very low and long tone, the Sasquatch screamed into the open air, "Agawamut!" That's my best interpretation there. The Sasquatch then turned away, and Inoki watched it disappear into the forest. Inoki recognized this as a thank you and goodbye gesture from his furry woodland friend. A few weeks after the friendly Sasquatch encounter, Inoki woke up to some strange sounds outside of his cabin. He walked outside to discover a stack of deerskin laying on the ground in front of his cabin door. They were fresh and ready for tanning. Then out in the distance, he heard a familiar call from the surrounding forest. Whether the Sasquatch stole the deer hides from a hunter or somehow skinned the deer is unknown, however, it is known that the creature continued bringing presents for Inoki that ranged from dry wood for fires to various berries and acorns. This gift giving went on over the course of several years. Although Inoki had absolutely no interest in money, he still had to work the odd job here or there to buy the few goods he could only acquire by purchasing. Things had changed a lot, and it had become extremely more difficult to live entirely off the land. A few years later, Inoki was approached by a group of white men from San Francisco regarding a business opportunity. He was asked to serve as the men's guide for a treasure hunt they were planning. The men had a map that detailed the location of a large quantity of hidden gold at Mount Shasta and were convinced that they could find it. Inoki agreed to act as the guide for the white men, who promised that in addition to his regular pay, he would receive a considered bonus if the gold was discovered, to which Inoki was completely indifferent. He grew up in a very different culture, where economic value was not derived from a piece of metal. Inoki was hardly able to conceal the fact that he felt all white men who partook in the endless search for a silly yellow metal were a little crazy. But nonetheless, he accepted the job. Within a few days, he was guiding the white men to Mount Shasta. With Inoki and the white treasure hunters arrived at the foot of Mount Shasta, the white men made camp and started to drink very heavily. The men proceeded to get intoxicated despite the fact that it was still morning. Being a man with a low tolerance of alcohol and an even lower tolerance for drunks, Inoki told the group of treasure hunters that he was going to explore the lower level rock shelves. His plan was twofold in that it was a task that needed to be done, and it provided Inoki a refuge from the loud and steadily drunker white men. He packed up a small day pack and made his way into the mountain later that morning. Inoki traveled a difficult mountain trail, and after a few hours of some tough climbing, he reached a rock shelf that he wanted to investigate further. That was when it happened. No, not a Sasquatch. He was the victim of the swift strike from a timber rattler. Inoki felt the pain shoot up his body like hot lightning. He quickly killed the snake, but it was too late. The damage was done and he was bitten. Inoki was fully aware that his best chances of survival meant he needed to quickly get back to the white men before the neurotoxic poison took control. He descended down one rock shelf and then another. However, by the third rock shelf, Inoki was having a very difficult time walking. His stomach turned and he became sick from fainting on the hard, rocky ground. The next thing that happened is truly amazing. Inoki eventually came to and woke up. He was sure that he was either dead or hallucinating because standing around him was 3 very large Sasquatch. Each one stood between 8 to 10 feet tall, and they were all watching Inoki. Inoki slowly twisted his leg to look down at the snake bite, and what he discovered greatly surprised him. His bite was covered in a patch of moss that was cool to the touch. Underneath the moss was a small primitive cut where the snake bite was. The Sasquatches had somehow managed to remove some of the poison from Inoki's body. It is inferred that they made a very primitive incision and sucked the poison out of Inoki, a very common practice with snake bites. Inoki looked up at the Sasquatch and recognized the familiar soft brown eyes. That he had seen years before on a deer trail. He smiled at his long-lost friend, who responded with two soft grunts. The other two Sasquatch effortlessly picked Inoki up off the ground like a rag doll and started to travel down a trail that Inoki had never seen before. The trail led Inoki and the Sasquatch down a steady descent, eventually bringing them near the foot of the mountain. The Sasquatch placed Inoki under a low, brushy tree. His forest friend from years before had two small grunts and gave Inoki one last look before all three disappeared up the mountain. After a few moments, Inoki heard a familiar cry echo through the air. It was a heartfelt goodbye. After a long while, Inoki started to feel better and eventually had the strength and wits to grab his .44 caliber cap and ball pistol. He let several rounds loose in the air to signal his location, and before long the white treasure hunters found him. After that, Inoki refused to ever bring any more white men to Mount Shasta, even refusing some ridiculously lucrative guiding contracts. When asked why he refused such great propositions, Inoki's only response was, "Matakagmi live, that holy place, I have friends there." Okay, picnic basket. This is one of those stories that really make you scratch your head and wonder. If the witness circumstances weren't what they are, then I probably wouldn't have included this account in the book. However, the witness circumstances are quite interesting. John is your stereotypical average Joe. He works as an HVAC technician in the heating and cooling industry. Generally, his workdays are rather mundane and slow-paced. He spends most of his work hours traveling to residential locations on service calls, installing piping and repairing draft holes. John had no reason to expect that this particular service call would be any different. However, by the time he is off the clock, John will have had one of the most memorable days of his life, a day he will never forget. John had just wrapped up his first service call and was heading to his second appointment, a routine call to a residence in the foothills of Mount Rainier. John was busy running through the various potential problems that could be causing the heat to stop functioning when he pulled into Sophia's driveway. John introduced himself to the customer, and Sophia walked him downstairs to the HVAC unit. After a quick check of the unit, John determined that he needed to check the home's outside existing structure. John grabbed his clipboard and headed outside. Now Sophia's house sits in a remote and heavily wooded area in the foothills of Mount Rainier. Her closest neighbor is a good 5-minute walk. John was familiar with the area from his many years of HVAC work and several service calls to surrounding areas. That is why John was so surprised when he thought he saw a large, shadowy human figure in the woods that surrounded Sophia's property. John then heard some rustling and gave the figure a better look. He watched as the large human-like shadow pushed branches out of its way and mumbled some indiscernible words. Then John got a clear glimpse of the figure and froze dead in his tracks. Sophia knew something was wrong as soon as John burst into the door. He seemed a bit disheveled. He was breathing heavy, and he was 2 shades lighter than a ghost. "Have you ever seen anything in the woods outside before?" John asked Sophia, to which she replied no. John then asked Sophia if she was interested in exploring the nearby woods to see what was out there, to which she agreed. Sophia grabbed a shotgun, her 2 dogs, and her and John went outside heading for the woods. They hadn't gone too deep into the forest when they noticed the shadowy figure again. They watched for a moment before the figure disappeared from view. Then, without warning, the creature stepped into full view, right only a few yards away, and right in front of them. The two stared in astonishment. They were face to face with a massive Sasquatch. It looked like a cross of a human and an ape, John told local authorities. During their brief encounter, the two were frightened. However, both reported that they felt that they were not in immediate danger. John and Sophia were in awe, shock, and surprise upon finding the massive creature. Neither of them had ever given much credibility or paid much mind to the creature's existence before. But now they were face to face with the mythical creature. The next thing that happened truly boggles the mind. In the extremely close and intimate encounter with the Sasquatch, reached forward and offered John and Sophia a present. He handed them a picnic basket. John accepted the picnic basket, after which the Sasquatch sprinted away and disappeared into the thick and dense forest. Local veterinarian and Bigfoot believer Joel Powles was one of the first to publicly state that the two had an encounter with Sasquatch, one of the first in that particular area. The Sasquatch probably borrowed or stole a picnic basket from a neighbor and was using it as a universal friendly gesture, so they knew he meant no harm. Powell said of the odd encounter, "Over the following weeks and months, Bigfoot hunters from across the country visited the area, hoping to have their own encounter with the area's friendly Sasquatch. There have been no further reports of encounters in the area since John and Sophia's." Okay, a Boy Scout and a Bigfoot. The following account comes from a man who insists the 100% on absolute anonymity. He is a man that comes from a very scientific background and is worried about the backlash that his account could have on his reputation and career. For the purpose of this account, we will call him Greg. Not only is Greg concerned about his reputation and career, but Greg also has an intimate understanding of our culture's reaction to claims of such fantastical encounters. These claims are bet with doubt and disbelief, which leads to the question of the individual's integrity or sanity. This is exactly what happened to Greg when he was 9 years old. He and his friend witnessed what they truly believed was a UFO. Today, Greg is unsure if it was indeed a UFO, but he is absolutely positive that whatever he saw was not an aircraft of the 1960s. As he matures, he came to accept that it was possible that he witnessed a secret government craft. Either way, at the time of the sighting, he believed it was a UFO, and the young boys immediately told everyone they knew about their sighting, and why shouldn't they? They were young, excited, and curious boys looking for answers to an inexplicable phenomenon they witnessed. But the reaction they received was less than welcoming. It took years before the UFO jokes finally subsided. This is the reason that for 30 years Greg never told a soul about his encounter. with the exception of his wife. Greg grew up in Texarkana in Arkansas side. He was a Boy Scout, outdoor adventurer, and all-around daredevil. However, his absence of risk aversion paled in comparison to that his best friend TG. TG was known amongst his fellow scouts as the Troop Daredevil, a nickname he definitely earned. Greg and his troop of Boy Scouts were on a weekend getaway in Arkansas. It was supposed to be a weekend full of planned events like canoeing and basic survival skills. On the second day of the trip, the troop set up a permanent camp for the remainder of the weekend. The planned activities for the afternoon consisted of scouts collecting edible plants and roots, while all the other scouts headed into the surrounding woods in search of edible plants. Greg and TG had an alternate afternoon activity plans. Instead, the two boys snuck down to the river and slipped away with a canoe. The boys were about to embark on an unsupervised whitewater rapid rafting trip. Their adventure began harmless enough, but soon the boys realized they bit off more than they could chew. After a short while, the two boys noticed a particularly rough patch of rapids ahead. They readied themselves for the rocky descent that was quickly approaching. The boys were about halfway through the treacherous rapids when the force of the water proved too much. They lost control of the canoe when it unexpectedly slammed its side very hard against a large boulder, sending Greg headfirst into the dangerous rapids. As soon as he hit the water, Greg felt the hard impact of a rock or log on his backside. Immediately, the force of the collision knocked all the breath out of Greg. He was getting tossed back and forth in the rapids while desperately trying to get his head above water for a breath of fresh air. But Greg had no idea which way was up. He struggled for a few minutes and then everything went black. Greg is unsure if he blacked out, drowned, partially drowned, had a concussion, or if he was simply getting tossed about so violently that he was fading in and out of consciousness. The first clear memory Greg has after falling into the water and blacking out was being ripped out of the water feet first. Something pulled him out of the river by his ankle. Greg's vision was a bit blurry from the water still pouring down his face. He lay on his side, struggling between breathing and coughing his lungs out. He vomited a large amount of water on the river bank and looked toward his savior and rescuer. Greg was expecting to see his troop leader or someone's father looking back down at him, but what he saw sent shockwaves down his spine. A few inches from Greg's face were two large furry legs that ended into two massive hairy feet. A bear, Greg thought to himself. Greg's savior then swung him around and threw him over his shoulder. Greg was confused and disoriented, had no idea what was happening. However, when he looked back to the river, he saw his fearless friend TG. TG was staring at Greg and his rescuer with a look of absolute and complete horror. His mouth was wide as if he intended to scream but couldn't. Silent scream, and he's the tough guy, Greg thought to himself. The next thing Greg knew, he was bouncing up and down, watching the woods around him pass by at a considerably fast pace while he still faded in and out of consciousness. Then everything went black again. Greg slowly opened his eyes. He didn't know where he was, how he got there, or how much time had passed. He surveyed his surroundings and discovered that he was lying on the ground of a cave or den in the mountain. It wasn't a log cabin, but it was shelter for now that was good enough. It was a chilly September day, and Greg was soaked to the bone. A cold chill ran down his spine, and then suddenly he felt the sensation of warm air passing over him. Wave after wave of warm air currently slowly raised Greg's body temperature. When Greg looked around the cave searching for the source of the warmth, he saw nothing. There wasn't a fire anywhere in the cave. Then everything went black again. Greg isn't sure if he fell asleep or passed out, but when he came to again, he heard and felt a very rhythmic, deep, and almost hollow breathing of what he could only assume was a massive animal. When Greg looked beneath him, he discovered that he was resting on a large bed of brush and debris, which he recalls smelling absolutely atrocious. He watched as the massive legs and feet of the hairy creature passed by him. The creature walked by with what seemed to be complete indifference to the Greg's presence. With low light visibility in the dark cave, Greg couldn't see his rescuer clearly, but the silhouette left a lot to the imagination. The creature was massive and stood between 8 to 10 feet tall, walked on two legs, was covered in hair, and powerful beyond any human's capability. Greg then laid his head down and faded away again. The next thing Greg knew he was waking up under some trees. His clothes were completely dry, he was warm, and he could hear the rushing water of the river nearby. He stood up and inspected his surroundings and discovered that he was only 10 yards in from the tree line by the river. Almost as soon as he woke, Greg heard the concerned cries from his fellow scouts, troop leader, and fathers calling out for him and TG. Greg walked out of the tree line and towards the river, only to find that the creature had left him only a few yards away from where he had saved him from drowning. Not only that, but TG was still in the canoe in a catatonic state. It took the better part of 5 minutes to shake TG out of it. The two were forced to leave the canoe behind and walk back to camp. TG refused to speak about the events that had happened that day. Greg was extremely understanding of TG's reluctance to talk about the event, especially considering Greg hadn't mentally processed the day himself. When the boys returned to camp, they arrived to a very unhappy troop leader. The two boys didn't tell anyone about the event. TG simply refused to speak about it, and since Greg's UFO sighting, he knew better than to invite ridicule and disbelief. The boys spent the rest of the weekend cleaning the latrine. A few weeks later, TG dropped out of scouts and the two boys lost contact, leaving Greg to wonder what TG had seen. Over the next 30 years, Greg kept his encounter a secret and only entrusted the experience to his wife. However, Greg did manage to find TG in the 90s thanks to the internet and social media. When he reached out to TG, asked about what he'd seen on that fateful day, he still refused to speak about it. An otherwise completely sane and rational man, Greg started to question his own sanity and sought out professional help that ranged from therapy to hypnosis. In the end, Greg couldn't deny what had happened to him and knew that acceptance was his only answer, despite any potential cultural friction. Today, he has fully accepted the truth. When Greg was 11 years old, he was saved from drowning and perhaps even hypothermia by a massive friendly Sasquatch. WVA Furry Friend. Sean was born and raised in good old West Virginia on his family's 64-acre plot of land. The land was situated in the mountains and was covered in rugged terrain and vast swaths of wilderness. In all directions, the closest neighbors were good family friends of Sean and his family, and they had 3 boys Sean's age. Sean grew up spending every weekend and summer playing with the three boys and their cousin. They spent the day from sunup to sunset, having adventures throughout the vast wilderness. They played cowboys and Indians, explored the depths of dark caves, snuck into old abandoned hunting cabins, and swam in the rivers and creeks that cut through the forest. Sean, Billy, Eddie, Andy, and Jason were the best friends, but there was a sixth member in the group that was rather different. Growing up in the rural and remote backwoods of West Virginia, especially during the time period, exposed Sean to an isolated culture. The largest demographic majority within the culture is composed of low-income white people who are, by and large, at least for the most part, racist. It is an unfortunate truth in many places throughout rural America. Luckily, Sean and his friends never caught the racism. One of the reasons could have been their mysterious sixth friend. The boys never knew where their friend lived. They simply met him one day while playing deep in the woods of West Virginia. Actually, every time they met their friend, it was only in the woods. He only came out to meet them once. They were very deep in the wilderness. He was shorter than the other boys, but his feet were huge, and he was covered in more hair than the other boys had combined. He was also considerably stronger than the other four despite being shorter. The boys had never met anyone who was not white, so they figured with that their friend was just a black person, or so they thought in the innocence of their youth. The overall consensus between the boys was that their hairy friend simply grew up differently than them due to cultural differences, but that never stopped them from having countless days of fun in the woods. Over the course of several years, Sean and his friends spent day after day with their hairy friend, having adventures into playing deep in the woods. The hairy boy never spoke a word to the other boys. Instead, they developed an interesting form of communication that included a lot of hand gestures, stick drawings in the mud, and varying sounds from the hairy boy that ranged from grunts to what sounded like bird songs. Their hairy woodland friend impressed the boys with his ability to mimic virtually every animal in the forest. He snored and drew deer in closer. He whistled and turkeys in the distance called back. He could howl into the air, and the moments later a coyote would return the call. As the boys grew older, their friend assisted them in hunts by helping lure animals close enough for the boys to take down, and when they went fishing, he would just disappear underwater and pop back up holding a fish. Although he helped the boys hunt and fish, their hairy friend never once ate meat that any of the boys ever saw. Instead, it picked berries, acorns, walnuts, roots, and edible plants. Sean vividly recalls one hot and sunny summer afternoon when his hairy friend got very angry when Sean and the other boys were about to eat some berries they had picked. It smacked the berries out of their hands in a scolding-like manner. When Sean returned home, he showed the berries to his father, who immediately asked if he ate any. His father then explained that the berries were extremely toxic and could have easily killed him. Upon their next visit in the woods, all the boys thanked their hairy friend for saving their lives. Over the years, the boys grew up, and soon they were riding ATVs through the forest, driving pickups to town, and chasing girls. Eventually, the boys had outgrown their childhood, and the summers and weekends of playing in the woods had come and gone. Soon their hairy friend was little more than a distant memory. That was until Sean was in his 30s. A few decades later, and Sean was with his childhood friend Jason, searching for a particular wild onion called rampant yellowroot golden seal. There is a heavy price tag associated with ramp and yellow root, which Sean and Jason hoped to cash in on. The two were competing with hundreds of other diggers, so they drove their ATVs very deep into the forest looking for the most remote places to dig. Eventually, they came across an area that they were confident no other diggers had been yet. They got off their ATV and started digging. The area they had discovered was promising for ramp, but shaded ground and lack of abundant water source suggested that they would have no luck finding yellow root. Yellow root grows near water and needs a lot of sunlight. However, to their utter surprise and delight, they were immediately rewarded when they discovered a patch laden with yellow root. Knowing not to question a good thing, two immediately got busy digging. Each root they unearthed seemed to be larger than the one before. The boys became perplexed. They noticed that the plants in the area around them were considerably larger than the others. They then noticed the way in which everything was growing seemed much more systematic than natural. It very much appeared as though someone had planted several different plant species here and was taking care of them. Shortly afterwards, the boys got the sense that they were being watched. Jason threw a rock at Sean to get his attention. When Sean looked to Jason, he saw that Jason was pointing across the creek behind them. Sean turned around and looked over the creek. About 50 yards away on the other side of the creek stood a massive creature. Initially, Jason and Sean nearly lost control of their bowel movements. They were so frightened. But they quickly realized the creature was their hairy childhood friend, all grown up, and he was no longer the shortest one. The two men quickly recognized the creature for what it was, both their long-lost childhood friend and a Sasquatch. They all stared at each other for about 45 minutes before Jason called out to their long-lost buddy, "We're just digging some yellow root. We'll go ahead and leave you some once we finish." The two men finished their digging and started heading to the ATVs when their long-lost friend let out a bone-chilling scream. The two turned back towards their friend, who was standing on the far side of the creek with what appeared to be an adult female Sasquatch, and a juvenile one as well, of which the men assumed was his family. "You got a good-looking family there," Sean yelled back to his Sasquatch buddy while waving goodbye. A few days passed before Sean and Jason returned to their secret digging hole in search of more yellow root. When the two arrived, they discovered the large bag of yellow root they had left for their Sasquatch friend was missing. In its stead was a large pile of wildflowers, acorns, and berries. Since that day, Sean has seen his friend a few times, but always from a distance. He does not believe that the creature is in any way dangerous, and actually believes quite the opposite. The humans are dangerous to Bigfoots. More recently, Sean has read some interesting reports about a local timber company that was pushing deeper and deeper into the woods. Somehow someone has inexplicably removed the tracks off of the bulldozers and thrown them down the hill on several occasions. There was never any evidence of another vehicle in the area, suggesting whoever did it managed to do so without a 4x4 truck. Eventually, the local papers laid the blame on mischievous children, despite the complete lack of evidence or suspects. Sean has a much different view. There's only one creature in the woods capable of taking a track off a bulldozer and throwing it a considerable distance down a hill: the friendly resident Bigfoot. Little Sam. This encounter originally appeared in True Bigfoot horror Book Zero with several other amazing encounters. The entire book is available on Amazon. At the time, Mrs. Perry was just a girl living in a broad shack in Alchita, Arkansas. It was over the course of the 1940s when her family first encountered the area's Bigfoot. For years, the family heard loud screams, whistles, and monkey-like noises coming from the surrounding woods over the winter months. Her father always told her that it was cougars, which she fully believed until he and his brother encountered 3 large female Bigfoots bathing in a wading pool at the bottom of a nearby river. Her father was extremely intrigued by the creatures, but her uncle wanted nothing to do with them. As a matter of fact, her uncle was so shook up over the encounter that he refused to ever go back into the woods again. Over the years, the seasons came and went, and every winter brought cold nights full of the screams of the local Bigfoots. When Mrs. Perry turned 5, her father was earning a living as a farmer and trapper. During the winter months, he spent the vast majority of his time in the woods working his trap lines. It was Mrs. Perry's 5th year in the life when canned goods started disappearing from the family smokehouse. The canned goods continued to steadily disappear before the ant was raised. Mrs. Perry's father went into the smokehouse one day and discovered that an entire hog he had just slaughtered, had smoked, had also disappeared. There was little doubt in his mind that the perpetrators were the local Bigfoots. Around the same time of the missing smokehouse goods, her father felt that someone or something was following him while he worked his trap lines. He was convinced of it. He started working his trap lines with an eagle eye, looking for his silent partner. Then one day he spotted him. It was a juvenile Bigfoot. He stood just north of 4.5 feet in height. He was covered in hair, had a small humpback, an ugly little face with long black whiskers jutting out along his jawline. And according to his father, he was a curious little critter, cute as a button, that one. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Perry's father brought extra food when he ran his trap lines, hoping to coax the critter out of hiding. Day after day, he warmly spoke with the creature, left food for it, and eventually earned its trust. Before long, her father and the little creature had become quite the pair. The family nicknamed the creature Little Sam, and over the years that followed, her father and Little Sam maintained an interesting relationship. Her father would oftentimes go into the woods, holler out for the creature, and within minutes Little Sam would pop up for a few treats and some quality time with his human buddy. The family diligently kept Little Sam a secret. The last thing that anyone wanted was the little guy to end up in some underground lab with wires and tubes sticking out of him. Mrs. Perry only saw the creature on 2 occasions throughout her childhood. However, her father spent a considerable amount of time with Little Sam. Eventually, the years made Mrs. Perry a young woman. She married and moved to Oklahoma, leaving her family and Little Sam back in Arkansas. Her parents never moved away from the shack. After a few decades, Mrs. Perry had a family of her own in Oklahoma and was busy raising her children when she received a sad letter from home. Her mother had written her to tell her the unfortunate news. Her husband, Mrs. Perry's father, had not seen Little Sam for a few months and grown very concerned for his friend's well-being. Her father had built a fatherly concern for the Bigfoot and didn't want to see any harm come to his long-time friend. Mrs. Perry's parents ventured into the woods to find Little Sam. They spent multiple days searching the remote wilderness and eventually found him. He had died, and Mrs. Perry's father was devastated. They buried little Sam in the woods and have yet to encounter another Bigfoot in the area. Mrs. Perry cried for her father and little Sam's passing while she read the letter. And all the time little Sam spent with her father, he never uttered a word. He only grunted and let out obvious sounds of pleasure when he got his tasty little treats. That's sad. Tim was new to the area. He only had 2 friends in all of the Stewart County, Tennessee. He had just bought 5 acres of hunting land from an old paper mill company, and he had just finished his term of service in the Navy. Everyone in town knew to stay off her property. Okay, I'll read one last story. Getaway Weekend. Like many Bigfoot encounters, the witness in this account has chosen to remain anonymous. For the purpose of this retelling, we will refer to him as Cliff. There is no such thing as an easy divorce, and Cliff was in the middle of a really bad one. His soon-to-be ex-wife and former in-laws were trying to take good old Cliff to the cleaners. He was in the middle of a heated custody debate as well as a vicious financial tug-of-war, and was starting to feel the wear and tear of the non-stop back and forth. He was on the verge of a mental breakdown. He decided to put all the legal issues and dilemmas aside for a few days and take a 4-day getaway to clear his head on a canoe trip to the great outdoors. The river he would be navigating was deep into the heart of Grizzly and Cougar County country. Cliff packed accordingly and set off. With more than ample supplies, Cliff's only problem was his canoe, which is at least 2 years past retirement. But Cliff was sure that his truly old companion was good for at least one more trip down the river. The first day of Cliff's canoe trip was far more relaxing and therapeutic getaway he was planning. He spent most of the day playing out several horrible divorce settlement scenarios, all of which left him fending for his life from the short end of the stick. However, on the second day of the trip, Cliff started to get with the program, and by the third day he managed to quiet the many speculative and negative voices in his head. Finally, he was able to truly clear his head and simply enjoy himself in nature. However, it was also the third day that Cliff would hit the roughest part of the river. Thanks to a week long of heavy rainfall and the river was high and strong, and Cliff was preparing to navigate the difficult rapids ahead, which he had done countless times before. As the rapids approached, Cliff skillfully read them and started to maneuver his canoe for safe passage. He was feeling the hot rush of adrenaline and was completely lost. In a moment, things couldn't have been going any better when horror struck. While navigating the rough rapids, Cliff's foot felt wet. Now wet feet in a canoe in harsh rapids are something to be expected, but his foot was not merely wet, it was submerged. He glanced down, and to his absolute horror, he discovered his canoe was taking on a lot of water and quickly. Cliff immediately started bailing water out of the canoe while simultaneously navigating the rapids. It wasn't long before the juggling act of bailing the water and navigating the river proved too much, and without any warning of Cliff's canoe overturned. The canoe was swept down the rapids with Cliff's head trapped underneath. He was submerged under the canoe while it barreled down the dangerous and rocky rapids. When things seemed that they couldn't get any worse, they did. Cliff's head violently collided with an underwater rock. The intense and solid thud echoed in his chest and everything went black. Next thing that Cliff recalls was being pulled out of the powerful water. His head was bleeding, his ankle was broken, and he was being carried towards the river bank by a massive Sasquatch. The Sasquatch gently carried Cliff up the bank and placed him under a tree. There was no time to stare at the creature in awe and reverence or enjoy the fact that he was just saved by a Sasquatch. Cliff was fully aware of the reality of his dangerous predicament. It was clear to Cliff that the Sasquatch had absolutely no intentions of harming him, but he was still stranded in the middle of cougar and grizzly country. He was injured, had no way to defend himself, he was unable to travel, and it was only an hour or so before darkness set in. He watched in fear as his rescuer, the Sasquatch, disappeared into the tree line shortly after saving Cliff's life. Cliff was alone. Over the next hour or so, Cliff analyzed his circumstances. The sun started to make its daily descent on the west horizon, and the darkness started to shroud the land in its dark veil. Things were not looking good for Cliff. He was completely vulnerable to any sort of attack, and it looked like he was going to spend the night unprotected under the stars in the remote wilderness. Right when things seemed their worst, Cliff heard the very loud crashing of branches and brush. It sounded like a wrecking crew was making their way through the dense woods beyond. Cliff turned his head toward the direction of the sound and watched as the Sasquatch that saved him, identifiable from this patch of gray hairs on the back of his neck, and several others emerged from the timber. The one that saved Cliff walked up to him and placed a stick on the ground in front of him. Cliff was thoroughly surprised when he saw that the creatures had sharpened the stick into a primitive spear. He watched in utter amazement as the creatures circled around him. One after another, they started to urinate on the ground, and within a few seconds, every Sasquatch was urinating on the ground, creating a circle around Cliff. He watched as the creatures passed feces in a way that clearly defined a perimeter around Cliff. Shortly after, Cliff's failing strength proved too much and he passed out again. By the time Cliff came to, the Sasquatches had disappeared again and the day had long slipped away. To his shock and delight, he found that the creatures had built a fire nearby which they had left with a large stack of wood for fuel. He also discovered berries and a clay pot full of fresh water. As the night grew later, Cliff started hearing the noises of the forest, nocturnal creatures waking up for their day. Included in this list of animals are the occasional cougar or bear. Sure enough, at some point during the course of the night, Cliff spotted a cougar circling him only 30 yards away. But when the large cat came closer to the circle the Sasquatch had created, it quickly ran away into the darkness. Later that night, a black bear would appear with the same results. Feeling fatigued, short of strength, and after witnessing the effectiveness of the Sasquatch circle, felt comfortable enough to sleep. When he woke the next morning, he was delighted to see that his sleeping bag was next to him. He sat up and unrolled the drenched sleeping bag to let it dry in the sun. Then one after another, the Sasquatches reappeared from behind the tree line, each one carrying a personal item of Cliff's. They brought him his tackle box, his canned goods, and other belongings, including his first aid kit. Then they all disappeared back into the forest. Cliff cleaned his wounds and hungrily devoured a can of beef stew. He felt his strength coming back to him and started to try and figure out how he could get back to civilization. He laid the empty can next to him and started to inventory his items. Just then, one of the Sasquatches appeared from the trees carrying what Cliff assumed was the last of his belongings. He tried his best to display gratitude toward the creature. The creature made a gesture to the empty can next to Cliff. Cliff picked the can up and held it out towards the creature, who eagerly and excitedly grabbed it. In an attempt to try and fully show his gratitude, Cliff then handed his fishing knife to the creature. After seeing the spear they had given him, he assumed that they had some sort of a cutting utensil that he was sure that his professional expensive fishing knife would be a definite upgrade. Shortly after, the exchange of the rest of the Sasquatches appeared and started to urinate and defecate to reinforce the circle. It was at this moment when the one who saved Cliff looked him dead in the eyes and started speaking. Cliff couldn't understand anything the creature said, but it was abundantly clear that it was a language that and the creature was trying to communicate with Cliff. He kept repeating the same sounds over and over again while pointing up the river. Cliff could feel a reassuring sense emanating from his newfound friend and savior. It was a sense that everything was okay. Shortly after, Cliff's friends disappeared into the woods for the last time. No sooner than Cliff was able to stand up, two canoers came from the direction that his friend the Sasquatch had kept pointing. He was trying to tell him that help was up the river and heading towards him. The canoers quickly came to shore and brought Cliff back to safety. That's the end of that story. It was an amazing story. Wow. Thank you guys, everyone, for joining me for this interesting book. You can get it on Amazon as well. It's like a Amazon book reading. Lots of fun. Have a good night, everybody.